A billionaire was indifferent to women until he saw a young woman dancing in the rain, and then Alexander Reed stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching his reflection against the Manhattan skyline. At 35, his dark hair already showed touches of silver at the temples, and his steel-gray eyes carried a weariness that his impeccable Tom Ford suit couldn't hide. The city below was dotted with buildings bearing his name, monuments to his success, yet somehow they felt hollow tonight. "Mr. Reed, your 9 a.m. is waiting." His assistant's voice came through the intercom, "and the board needs the final approval on the Chelsea development project." "Send 'em in," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark. His office, like his life, was a study in minimalist perfection. Clean lines, modern furniture, and not a single personal photo. The only decoration was a large abstract painting, chosen for its investment potential rather than emotional connection. Every element in his world was carefully controlled, measured, and optimized for success. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and property valuations. By late afternoon, Alexander found himself alone again, reviewing contracts as the sun began its descent over the Hudson River. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother. "Sweetie, I was just thinking about the charity gala next weekend. I worry about you being alone all the time. It would make me so happy to see you with someone special." He stared at the message, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest. His mother's concern was genuine, which somehow made it harder to ignore. His last relationship had ended 2 years ago, another casualty of his relentless drive to build his empire. Since then, he had convinced himself that relationships were a distraction he couldn't afford. The cleaning staff had long gone home when Alexander finally left his office. The night security guard nodded respectfully as he passed through the lobby. "Good night, Mr. Reed. Don't work too hard." Alexander almost smiled at the irony. Hard work was all he knew. His driver held the door of the black Mercedes open. "Home, sir?" "The gym first," Alexander replied, loosening his tie. Even his workout routine was scheduled, another piece of his carefully controlled existence. As the car glided through the rain-slicked streets, he reviewed his calendar for tomorrow. Board meetings, site inspections, investment reviews, each hour meticulously planned. Yet lately, something felt different. The success that had once driven him now left him feeling oddly empty. His phone lit up again, this time with a message from his younger sister. "Big bro, when was the last time you actually had fun? And no, closing a multi-million-dollar deal doesn't count." The question lingered uncomfortably in his mind. His penthouse, filled with expensive furniture and priceless art, felt more like a museum than a home. The views that had once inspired him now seemed to mock his solitude. Through the rain-streaked window, he watched people hurrying home to their families, ducking under umbrellas, laughing despite the weather. Each lit window in the passing buildings represented a life being lived, a story unfolding, moments being shared. Meanwhile, he sat in his perfectly ordered world, surrounded by everything money could buy, yet increasingly aware of what was missing. The car stopped at a red light, and Alexander watched a couple sharing an umbrella, the woman laughing as her partner pulled her close to avoid the rain. When was the last time he had felt that kind of spontaneous joy? That connection with another person that had nothing to do with business or social obligation? His carefully constructed world had brought him everything he thought he wanted: success, power, respect. But sitting in the back of his luxury car, watching the city life unfold around him, Alexander Reed couldn't shake the feeling that he had built his empire at the cost of something essential, something that all his careful planning and control couldn't provide. The rain intensified as they approached his private gym, the droplets racing down the windows like tears. Tomorrow would be another perfectly scheduled day, another series of meetings and decisions, another step toward greater success. Or so he thought. Little did he know that fate was about to throw his perfectly ordered world into beautiful chaos, beginning with an unexpected encounter that would teach him that sometimes the best things in life can't be controlled, scheduled, or planned, and his life will change with a dance in the rain. The rain had started unexpectedly that evening, turning Manhattan into a gleaming landscape of reflected lights. Alexander had dismissed his driver earlier, wanting to walk the few blocks back to his penthouse after a particularly draining board meeting. Now, as the rain intensified, he stood under the awning of a small cafe, watching the city transform into a watery wonderland. That's when he saw her. In the small plaza across the street, a woman was dancing in the rain. Not hurrying through it like the other pedestrians, not seeking shelter, but actually dancing. Her movements were fluid and graceful, professional yet free. She wore a simple white dress that now clung to her body, her dark hair wild and untamed in the downpour. Alexander found himself transfixed. The woman, who he would later know as Lila Carter, spun and twirled, her arms raised to the sky as if embracing the storm itself. Her joy was so pure, so unrestrained, it seemed to illuminate the gray evening. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something stir within him, a recognition of something he'd lost long ago, the ability to find joy in simple moments, to dance without caring who was watching, to be truly, unabashedly free. Without conscious thought, he stepped out from under the awning. The rain immediately soaked through his $1,000 suit, but for once, he didn't care. He found himself walking toward the plaza, drawn by an unforce he couldn't explain. The dancer noticed him approaching and slowed her movements, but didn't stop. Instead, she smiled, a brilliant, unguarded smile that seemed to challenge everything his controlled world represented. "You look like you could use a dance," she called out, her voice carrying clearly despite the rain. Alexander stopped, momentarily stunned by her directness. "I don't dance," he replied, realizing how stiff and formal his voice sounded even to his own ears. She laughed, the sound as free as her movements. "Everyone can dance. Some of us just forget how." Before he could respond, she had crossed the space between them and taken his hand. Her touch was warm despite the cool rain, and Alexander felt an electric current run through him at the contact. "I'm Lila," she said, her eyes, a striking shade of green, meeting his directly. "And you look like a man who's forgotten how to feel the rain." In that moment, looking into her eyes, Alexander felt the carefully constructed walls of his world begin to crack. Here was someone who seemed to exist entirely outside the realm of spreadsheets, board meetings, and careful planning. Someone who could find joy in a rainstorm and dance without music. "Alexander," he found himself saying, his usual formal introduction forgotten. "Alexander Reed." "Well, Alexander Reed," she smiled, still holding his hand. "Are you brave enough to dance in the rain with a stranger?" The old Alexander would have pulled away, cited a meeting, retreated to the safety of his controlled environment. But something about this moment, the rain, her smile, the way the city lights reflected in her eyes, made him pause. And then, in a decision that would change the course of his life, Alexander Reed, CEO of Reed Properties, the man known for his iron control and perfect planning, did something completely unexpected. The days following their rain-soaked encounter took on a dreamlike quality for Alexander. He found himself thinking about Lila at unexpected moments, during board meetings, while reviewing contracts, as he stared out at the city skyline from his office. Their first proper date happened 3 days after the rain dance. Alexander had managed to find her. She was a professional contemporary dancer with a small but respected dance company in the city. He invited her to dinner at Le Bernardin, one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. "You know," Lila said, looking amusingly out of place in the formal setting with her artistic bohemian style, "I would have been just as happy with pizza in the park." Her honesty was refreshing, cutting through the pretense that usually surrounded his business dinners. That night, they ended up leaving the restaurant early, finding a small pizza place in the village where Lila insisted they eat with their hands. "Life's too short for unnecessary forks," she declared, making Alexander laugh genuinely for the first time in years. As weeks passed, their worlds began to intertwine in unexpected ways. Lila introduced him to her world of art and spontaneity. She took him to small underground dance performances, hole-in-the-wall restaurants with amazing food, and quiet bookstores where they could spend hours talking. "You see that building?" Alexander found himself explaining one evening as they walked through the city. "The architecture tells a story of New York's evolution from the industrial age to the modern era." Lila listened with genuine interest, seeing the city through his eyes, just as he was learning to see it through hers. She showed him how to appreciate the street art in Brooklyn, the impromptu jazz sessions in Washington Square Park, the poetry in everyday moments he'd always been too busy to notice. Their differences were stark. Where Alexander planned everything, Lila embraced spontaneity. While he wore tailored suits, she preferred flowing dresses and combat boots. His world was built on structure and control, hers thrived on creativity and freedom. Yet somehow these differences drew them closer. Alexander found himself loosening his tight schedule to accommodate impromptu afternoon walks or late-night conversations. Lila, in turn, showed up on time for their dates, understanding his need for some measure of predictability. One evening, as they sat on the rooftop of his penthouse sharing a bottle of wine, Lila asked, "When was the last time you did something just because it made you happy?" The question caught him off guard. "My work makes me happy," he answered automatically. "No," she shook her head, her eyes serious. "Not successful, not accomplished, happy. Pure, simple happiness, like a child feeling rain for the first time." Alexander couldn't remember, and that realization shook him. Lila reached over and took his hand, her touch now familiar and comforting. "Then we have some work to do," she smiled, that same brilliant smile that had first captured his attention in the rain. As they sat there, the city lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars, Alexander realized he was changing. The rigid boundaries of his world were softening, making room for something new, something unpredictable and wonderful. But with this change came a new kind of fear. The fear of losing control, of letting someone past his carefully constructed defenses. And soon, that fear would be tested in ways he never expected. The first real test of their relationship came with the Hudson Yards redevelopment project, a multi-billion-dollar deal that could either cement Reed Properties' position as New York's leading real estate developer or become its biggest failure. "Mr. Reed," his assistant interrupted one of his rare lunch breaks with Lila, "the investors from Shanghai are demanding an emergency meeting. They're threatening to pull out." Alexander's face hardened into the mask of control that Lila had watched slowly soften over their months together. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, already reaching for his suit jacket. "Go," Lila said softly, understanding in her eyes. "Your empire needs you." The following weeks became a blur of 18-hour workdays, international conference calls, and endless negotiations. Alexander's carefully maintained work-life balance began to crumble. Dinner dates were canceled, phone calls went unanswered, and text messages received brief, distracted responses. One evening, Lila showed up at his office unannounced, carrying takeout from their favorite Italian restaurant. She found him surrounded by blueprints and financial reports, his tie loosened, hair disheveled from running his hands through it in frustration. "When was the last time you ate?" she asked, setting down the food. "I'm fine," he replied automatically, not looking up from his documents. "I just need to finish this." "Alexander," her voice was gentle but firm, "the work will still be here after you've eaten." He finally looked up, ready to argue, but the concern in her eyes made him pause. For the first time, he noticed it was past midnight. His office lights were the only ones still burning in the building. 20 minutes, he conceded, pushing away from his desk. As they ate, Lila didn't push or complain about his absence. Instead, she asked about the project, genuinely interested in understanding what was consuming so much of his time and energy. "It's not just about the money," he found himself explaining. "This project could transform an entire neighborhood, create thousands of jobs, build something lasting." "I understand," she said, and he could see that she did. "But who's going to enjoy all that transformation if they're working themselves to death?" The comment hit closer to home than she probably intended. Alexander had been avoiding his reflection lately, not wanting to see the dark circles under his eyes or the tension in his face. The real crisis came a week later. Lila's dance company was performing their season premiere, a show she'd been rehearsing for months. Alexander had promised to be there, had even cleared his schedule weeks in advance. But that morning, news broke that one of their major investors was wavering. The entire project teetered on the edge of collapse. Alexander spent hours in emergency meetings, watching the clock with growing anxiety. At 7:28 p.m., 2 minutes before the performance was set to begin, he sent a text. "Emergency at work, can't make it. I'm sorry." Lila's response came hours later, after her performance had ended. "I understand, but understanding doesn't make it hurt less." That night, alone in his office, with the city lights twinkling mockingly outside his window, Alexander faced a truth he'd been avoiding. He was falling back into old patterns, letting work consume everything else in his life. But this time, the cost felt higher than ever before. He stared at Lila's message for a long time, realizing he stood at a crossroads. The path forward would require changes he wasn't sure he was ready to make. The morning after missing Lila's performance, Alexander sat in his office, staring at a framed photograph she had given him, a black and white image of them dancing in the rain, captured by a street photographer on the night they met. It was the only personal item in his otherwise sterile office. His phone buzzed with another urgent email, but instead of immediately responding, he found himself dialing a different number. "Marcus," he addressed his VP of Operations, "I need you to take point on the Shanghai negotiations today." There was a stunned silence on the other end. In 15 years, Alexander Reed had never voluntarily stepped back from a major negotiation. "Sir?" Marcus questioned, clearly uncertain. "You've been with me for 10 years. You know this project inside and out. Handle it." Alexander's tone left no room for discussion. "I have something important I need to take care of." An hour later, Alexander stood in the doorway of Lila's dance studio, watching her rehearse. She moved with fluid grace, her body telling stories without words. When she finally noticed him, she stopped mid-motion, surprise evident on her face. "Shouldn't you be saving your empire?" she asked, a hint of hurt still lingering in her voice. "My empire will survive one day without me," he replied, stepping into the studio. "But I'm not sure I can survive losing you." He pulled out a small notebook, his ever-present schedule keeper, and held it out to her. "I want you to help me rewrite this." Lila took the notebook, confusion crossing her features. "I've spent years scheduling every minute of my life," Alexander explained, "but I never scheduled time for what matters most. I want to change that. I want to find balance." Over lunch, they began restructuring his schedule together. Lila added blocks of time labeled "Dance with Girlfriend" and "Spontaneous Adventure." Alexander insisted on keeping some structure, but agreed to build in flexibility. "It's not about choosing between work and life," Lila said as they worked. "It's about making room for both." The changes weren't easy. Alexander struggled with delegating responsibilities he'd always handled personally. He felt physical anxiety the first time he left the office at 5 p.m. for one of Lila's performances, but each time he chose balance over control, he found his world didn't collapse. It expanded. He started attending Lila's rehearsals during lunch breaks, finding that watching her dance cleared his mind and actually improved his afternoon productivity. She, in turn, began accompanying him to some business dinners, her artistic perspective offering fresh insights that impressed even his most conservative clients. One evening, after a particularly successful day, where he'd closed a major deal and still made it to Lila's dance class, they stood on his penthouse balcony. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, leaning into him. "I know how hard this is." "It's still terrifying," he admitted. "Every time I step away, I worry everything will fall apart." "But it hasn't," she reminded him. "Maybe the real strength isn't in controlling everything. It's in knowing when to let go." Alexander pulled her closer, realizing that in loosening his grip on control, he'd gained something far more valuable, the ability to truly live in the moment. But their journey wasn't over. The biggest challenge was yet to come, one that would test their newfound balance in ways neither of them expected. The invitation arrived on embossed paper, announcing the most prestigious real estate awards gala of the year. Reed Properties was nominated for Developer of the Year, largely due to the successful completion of the Hudson Yards project. The same evening, Lila's dance company was scheduled to premiere their groundbreaking new production, Breaking Walls, with Lila in the leading role. Alexander stared at the two events in his calendar, the dates mocking him with their perfect overlap. The gala represented everything he'd worked for: recognition, success, validation. Lila's performance represented everything he'd grown to value: passion, artistry, love. "You should go to the gala," Lila said when he told her, her voice carefully neutral. "It's important for your company." But Alexander could see the hope in her eyes, the unspoken wish that for once he would choose differently. They were sitting in her small apartment, the space filled with dance photographs and scattered point shoes, a world so different from his sterile penthouse. "The board expects me to be there," he said slowly. "The investors." "I know," she interrupted softly, getting up to make tea, her ritual when emotions ran high. "I understand." But this time, her understanding felt like a weight rather than a relief. Alexander watched her move around her tiny kitchen, remembering how she'd danced in the rain that first night, free and uninhibited. How different from the careful way she now moved around him, as if afraid to ask for too much. The days leading up to the event were filled with mounting pressure. The board members kept emphasizing how crucial the gala was for their public image. His mother called, excited about the society photographers who would be present. Even his sister texted, "Finally getting the recognition you deserve, big bro." The morning of the big day, Alexander was in his office adjusting his bow tie when his assistant brought in the morning paper. On the arts page was a photo of Lila in rehearsal, her body curved in an elegant arc, the headline reading, "Breaking Walls, a revolutionary fusion of classical and contemporary dance." He picked up the paper, reading the interview where Lila spoke about the performance. "This piece is about breaking free from the constraints we put on ourselves, about finding the courage to choose love over fear." Alexander sat down heavily in his chair, the words resonating deep within him. Wasn't that what their entire relationship had been about? Him learning to break free from his self-imposed constraints? At that moment, his phone buzzed with a message from the board chairman. "Car will pick you up at 7 p.m. sharp for the gala. Big night for Reed Properties." Alexander looked at the message, then at the newspaper photo of Lila. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. He pressed the intercom. "Cancel my car for tonight," he instructed his assistant. "And call Marcus." "Sir?" "Tell him he's representing Reed Properties at the gala. He's earned it." Standing up, Alexander grabbed his coat and headed for the door. He had a different destination in mind, one that wouldn't lead to more business success or social recognition, but somewhere far more important. He had a dance performance to attend. The theater was already darkening when Alexander slipped into his seat in the front row. He could feel his phone vibrating continuously in his pocket, undoubtedly a flood of messages from board members and investors wondering where he was. For the first time in his career, he switched it off completely. As the curtain rose, his heart pounded with an unfamiliar mixture of anxiety and excitement. Not the usual anxiety about business deals or market fluctuations, but a deeper, more personal fear. the fear of having made a choice that would forever alter the careful structure of his life. Lila appeared on stage, her presence commanding the theater. The performance was titled Breaking Walls, but Alexander hadn't truly understood its meaning until this moment. As he watched her dance, every movement telling a story of breaking free from constraints, he saw his own journey reflected in her art. During the intermission, he overheard whispers around him. "Did you hear? Alexander Reed isn't at the Developer of the Year ceremony. The whole industry is there." His career might never recover from this snub. Instead of the panic these words might have once triggered, Alexander felt an unexpected sense of peace. For the first time, he was choosing to be exactly where he wanted to be, regardless of the consequences. The second act began with Lila performing a solo piece. Her movements spoke of struggle, of breaking free, of finding courage. Alexander recognized the emotion in every gesture. It was the same battle he'd been fighting within himself since the day they met. As the performance reached its climax, Lila executed a series of spectacular leaps across the stage, each one seeming to defy gravity, each one representing another barrier broken. The audience held its breath, completely captivated. In that moment, watching her soar across the stage, Alexander confronted his deepest fear, the fear of losing control. He realized that control had been his shield, his way of protecting himself from life's uncertainties, but it had also been his prison. The performance ended to thunderous applause. Alexander remained seated as the audience around him rose for a standing ovation. His mind was racing, processing the magnitude of what he'd just witnessed, not just on stage but within himself. Backstage, he found Lila still in her costume, surrounded by well-wishers. When she saw him, her eyes widened in surprise, then filled with tears. "You came," she whispered as he approached. "But the gala—" "I'm exactly where I need to be," he replied, pulling her into his arms, not caring about the stage makeup that would surely stain his expensive suit. Later that night, they sat in a small 24-hour diner, Lila still in her stage makeup, Alexander in his tuxedo. His phone remained off, the outside world temporarily shut away. "Are you scared?" she asked, stirring her coffee. "About what this might mean for your career?" Alexander considered the question carefully. "Yes," he admitted. "But I'm more scared of going back to who I was before, of being so focused on controlling everything that I miss what's really important." Lila reached across the table and took his hand. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let go of what we think we need to hold on to." As they sat there, in that quiet diner in the early hours of the morning, Alexander realized that facing his fears hadn't weakened him. It had made him stronger in ways he never expected. News of Alexander Reed's absence from the award ceremony spread quickly through the real estate industry. The next morning's headlines all centered around his unexpected decision. But instead of feeling anxious, Alexander found himself liberated. In the emergency board meeting that was called, Alexander stood before the concerned and skeptical faces of the board members. "I know many of you think I've lost my mind," he began, his voice steady, "but I've never been clearer about my direction and the direction of this company." He presented a new vision, a more balanced approach to business where success was measured not just in profits, but in positive impact on people's lives. "Reed Properties doesn't just build buildings," he said. "We build communities, and to do that effectively, we need a deeper understanding of people and the art of living." Surprisingly, Marcus, who had represented the company at the award ceremony, was the first to show support. "Actually, your absence last night generated more discussion about Reed Properties than your presence would have." In the weeks that followed, Alexander began implementing changes within the company. He created artistic spaces in new development projects, collaborating with local artists to bring art into public spaces. Lila became an advisor for the company's cultural projects, bringing fresh perspectives on creating vibrant and meaningful spaces. "You've changed so much," his mother remarked one evening while visiting his office. She was looking at a new photograph on the wall, one of Alexander and Leela at the opening of the company's first community art space. "I'm still me," Alexander replied. "I just stopped trying to control everything." The transformation wasn't just professional. Alexander found himself smiling more, laughing easier. The rigid schedule that once ruled his life gave way to a more fluid approach, making room for spontaneity and joy. During a board presentation of their newest development project, Alexander surprised everyone by bringing in dancers from Lila's company to demonstrate how space could be used creatively. The traditionally conservative board members found themselves captivated by the innovative approach. "Our buildings shouldn't just be structures," he explained. "They should be spaces that inspire, that encourage connection and creativity." The market responded positively to Reed Properties' new direction. Their projects began attracting a diverse mix of tenants, from traditional businesses to artistic ventures. The press that had initially questioned Alexander's judgment now praised his innovative vision. One afternoon, as they sat in Lila's dance studio, she turned to him and asked, "Do you regret it? That night?" Alexander looked at the woman who had changed his life, smiling. "It was the best decision I ever made. Sometimes you have to lose something to find what matters more." Lila took his hand, pulling him to his feet. "In that case, would you like to dance?" And in the sunset light streaming through the studio windows, they danced together, without music, following only the rhythm of their hearts. The transformation was complete. Alexander Reed was no longer just the calculating businessman who measured success in dollars and cents. He had become someone who understood that true success was found in the balance between ambition and joy, control and spontaneity, business and art. As they swayed together in the fading light, Alexander realized that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards, not in the form of profits or awards, but in the profound satisfaction of living life fully and authentically. 1 year after that fateful night at the theater, Alexander stood on the rooftop garden of Reed Properties' newest development, the Harmony Tower. The space was transformed into an enchanting venue, with fairy lights twinkling above and the city skyline creating a perfect backdrop. This wasn't just another corporate event. Tonight was the grand opening of what the press had dubbed New York's first truly integrated arts and business complex. The building featured traditional office spaces alongside dance studios, art galleries, and performance venues. It was the physical manifestation of everything Alexander and Lila had worked toward over the past year. "Mr. Reed," a young reporter approached him, notebook in hand. "Your competitors said mixing business with arts was financial suicide, but the Harmony Tower is already fully leased. What made you so confident in this vision?" Alexander's eyes found Lila across the room, where she was chatting with a group of artists and entrepreneurs. She was wearing a flowing evening gown, but he could still see the dancer in her graceful movements. "Sometimes," he replied, "the best business decisions come from listening to your heart rather than your spreadsheets." The evening progressed with performances from local artists, including Lila's dance company. The crowd watched in awe as dancers performed throughout the space, bringing the building's philosophy to life. During a quiet moment, Alexander led Lila to a private corner of the rooftop garden. The city lights sparkled below them, reminiscent of the night they first met in the rain. "Do you remember what you told me that first night?" he asked. "About dancing in the rain?" Lila smiled. "That sometimes you have to let go of control to find true joy." "You were right," Alexander said, taking her hand. "And you've taught me so much more since then, about balance, about courage, about love." He dropped to one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring that captured their journey, a traditional diamond surrounded by smaller stones in a pattern that resembled a dancer in motion. "Lila," his voice was soft but sure, "you showed me how to dance in the rain. Would you dance with me for the rest of our lives?" Tears glistened in Lila's eyes as she nodded, pulling him to his feet and into a kiss. Applause erupted around them. Their friends and family had gathered quietly to witness the moment. Later that night, as the party wound down, they stood together, looking out over the city. The Harmony Tower stood as a testament to their journey, a perfect blend of his world and hers. "What's next?" Lila asked, leaning into him. "Well," Alexander smiled, "I was thinking about expanding the concept to other cities. People everywhere need spaces that nurture both their professional and creative spirits. And personally, he pulled her closer, I'm looking forward to many more dances in the rain." As if on cue, soft drops began to fall. Instead of rushing inside like the other guests, Alexander and Lila stayed where they were, letting the rain fall around them. And there, on the rooftop of their shared dream, they danced. They had created something unique, a love story that transformed not just their lives, but the lives of others. The Harmony Tower would stand as a symbol of what happens when you dare to break down walls, when you have the courage to choose love over fear, and when you learn to dance in life's unexpected moments. As they swayed together in the gentle rain, both knew that this wasn't an ending, but rather a beautiful beginning. Their story would continue to unfold, one dance step at a time.